They said it was a disappearance, but they ignored 5 facts that could change everything. What you're about to see might turn this case upside down. Imagine a white wall, completely clean. In the center, a single crack, thin and almost invisible. At first glance, nothing special. But if you get closer, you realize it extends deep within the structure, silent, deep, ready to bring down everything that once seemed solid. The Madeleine McCann case is that wall. And today we're going to take a close look at this crack, because what it reveals could dismantle the entire story you've heard until now. They said it was a disappearance, a tragedy without culprits, without witnesses, without answers. But what no one mentioned or chose to forget is that there were 5 pieces of evidence right in front of everyone that simply vanished from the official narrative. We're not talking about assumptions. We're talking about filed documents, ignored testimonies, inconsistencies in statements, and traces pointing in directions that were never pursued. The whole world looked at that room in Portugal as if it were the final chapter. But what if it was just the beginning? This video is longer than the screams. About the details that no one wanted to highlight. About 5 facts that were not only ignored, but that, if they had been treated with the necessary seriousness, might have changed everything. While headlines splashed comforting theories, parents wept in front of cameras, and the police searched for clues, some truths simply evaporated. And the most frightening part is that this wasn't by accident. In each of these 5 pieces of evidence, there was something inconvenient, something unsettling, something that didn't fit the accepted version. The unseen pain is this: when justice seems to work, but only for those it chooses to protect. When truth becomes a threat, not a priority. And at the center of it all, a missing girl and a family shrouded in questions that no one dares to ask out loud. What you're about to see is not theory. It's what was hidden in plain sight. If this evidence had been treated as it should have been, maybe the story would have been different. Maybe the truth wouldn't have been buried for so long. If you want to see what few have had the courage to face, come with me. Imagine a child disappearing. Not in the outskirts, not in a dangerous neighborhood, but in one of Europe's most popular tourist destinations. British parents, respected doctors, dining with friends in a restaurant just a few meters away from the room where they left their children sleeping alone. And then they realize that their eldest daughter, Madeleine, is gone. The news explodes. Within hours, her face is in every newspaper. The story becomes an international sensation, and the narrative is clear. It was a kidnapping. A cowardly, cruel act without explanation. The British press embraces the parents, and the Portuguese police launch an investigation. But soon, something starts to go wrong. Friends' accounts don't match. Timelines change. The reports are vague. There is silence where there should be certainty. And instead of clarity, each new day brings more confusion. Meanwhile, cameras accumulate in front of the hotel. The international media picks a side, that of the McCanns. They are portrayed as martyrs, no matter what is said. Meanwhile, the Portuguese police are labeled as incompetent, slow, unprepared. But if you look closely, it was in the first days that the most important evidence disappeared. The scene of the disappearance was contaminated. The room was accessed by dozens of people before any real forensic investigation could take place. Clothes were washed, and the clues simply ceased to exist. No one hit the brakes. On the contrary, the more the kidnapping narrative strengthened, the harder it became to question anything. And what seemed to be a case of justice began to look like something else, a silent agreement between those with the microphone and those with something to lose. The question that no one dared to ask back then was simple. What if the rush to turn the McCanns into official victims cost the chance to understand what really happened? Things grew even stranger when investigators began to suspect that something didn't add up. The timeline given by the Friends, the famous Top 7 group, was full of gaps. Timings didn't match, accounts changed. People who claimed to have gone to see the children couldn't even remember for sure. Even so, every time a police officer pointed out inconsistencies, the pressure increased. British journalists appeared with ready headlines, disqualifying any suspicion. Representatives of the British government arrived in the Algarve, diplomatically of course, but always siding with the parents. And anything that contradicted the kidnapping version started disappearing from the news. Even Gonçalo Amaral, the lead investigator on the case, was removed. Later, he wrote a book revealing what he saw from the inside. And what did he reveal? That the investigation was stalled from within, that there were clues that were never pursued, that sniffer dogs detected the scent of blood and human remains in the car rented by the McCanns weeks after the disappearance. but that detail was simply shelved. Now stop and think. If it had been a poor, unknown foreign family on European soil, would they have received the same treatment, the same protection? Would they have been able to stop an entire investigation from following leads that, yes, pointed back to their own home? And the most important question, how many of these questions were actually asked in front of the cameras? What you're about to see are pieces of evidence that weren't hidden by accident. They were sidelined because they were dangerous, not to the investigation, but to those controlling what the world saw. And if the truth was buried, it wasn't for lack of evidence, but for an excess of silence. And it is in this silence that the most important clues or disappearance, something began to move behind the scenes, but not in the sense of justice. What was seen was a silent struggle between those who wanted to seek the truth and those who wanted to protect an image. The tension between the Portuguese and British police wasn't just bureaucratic, it had emotional, diplomatic, and political weight. On one side, local investigators trying to follow protocols, facing an international case unlike any they had seen before. On the other, British agents arriving with a supervisory stance, issuing instructions, pressing for a specific line of investigation, kidnapping by a stranger. No room to consider other possibilities. No willingness to listen when the pieces didn't fit. And in the midst of all this, the evidence began to vanish. Or worse, it began to be discarded even before it could be investigated. Local witnesses were ignored. Resort employees were never formally interviewed. Reports that carried important clues were set aside with a standard phrase, "not relevant to the case." And then comes the most unsettling part, the behavior of the media. British newspapers shielded the McCann's image from the very beginning. Instead of investigative coverage, they delivered a campaign of public solidarity. Every time a doubt arose, a headline splashed across the stands. Innocent parents, victims of police negligence. It was as if part of the press had swapped its role of watching power for the role of protecting it. Truth began to lose ground. And when that happens, the consequence isn't just injustice, it's silence. A silence that covers up documents, distorts memories, erases possibilities. And meanwhile, the little girl remained missing. The question that should have been on everyone's lips was, why did the evidence vanish? But all that was heard was the echo of the same repeated story. It was a kidnapping. It was a kidnapping. It was a kidnapping. Over days, weeks, months, one thing became clear. The official version couldn't be touched. Every time someone tried to open a new line of investigation, an obstacle appeared. Sometimes it was a journalist calling it a conspiracy theory. Other times it was a diplomat making an informal request to back off. And when lead investigator Gonçalo Amaral insisted on following what the evidence indicated, he was removed. His reputation was attacked. The book he later wrote, detailing everything he saw from the inside, became the target of legal action. He wasn't silenced due to lack of evidence. He was silenced because he saw what couldn't be told. This is where everything changes. The problem wasn't just the botched investigation. It was a system set in motion to ensure that certain questions would never be asked. Because the more they talked about the unknown monster that abducted Madeleine, the less they talked about what happened that night inside the apartment. And then there's the role of social media. They not only divided people between for and against the McCanns, they created battlefields, tribes, aggressive comments, cancellations, blind idolization. Everything that diverted attention from the real center of the story, the missing child and the evidence that was never taken seriously. In the end, there's this bitter feeling. The system seemed less interested in solving the case and more concerned with protecting those who had reputations to lose. And when that happens, justice becomes a theater, evidence turns into props, and silence becomes a powerful ally. But not all silence is eternal. There's something coming now that might change the way you see this case from the very beginning. And this time, the pieces that were hidden will start to appear, one by one. Now that you understand what was left out, it's time to face what was hidden right in front of everyone. The truth didn't vanish. It was right there. Only no one wanted to look. Evidence number 1. Sniffer dogs specialized in detecting the scent of blood in human remains. They were taken to the apartment and the car rented by the parents. And what happened? The dogs reacted at specific points, in the trunk, behind the sofa. But this line of investigation was abandoned quickly, as if it were too inconvenient, as if it shouldn't exist. Evidence 2. Kate McCann's diary, at first described as personal, intimate, full of pain, later re-released as a book, with passages rewritten, edited, softened. In one version, there were phrases indicating exhaustion with the children, a silent plea for a break. Those words disappeared in subsequent editions. Why? Evidence 3. Phone calls made on the night of the disappearance, which don't appear in the official reports. There are incomplete records, timings that don't match, numbers that were omitted, emergency calls that weren't directed to the emergency number, calls made even before confirming the disappearance. Have you ever seen Evidence 4, the testimonies of the group of friends, the so-called Tapas 7. They were dining with the parents that night, but the timings don't match. Some said they saw Madeleine sleeping at 9 p.m. Others claimed they went to check at 9:30 p.m. At times, no one knew who was with whom, and yet everyone said they knew exactly what had happened. Evidence 5. The resort employees. Staff who were there that night. Some heard things. Others saw something, but many were never formally interviewed. Others were fired shortly after, and they vanished from the story as if they had never existed. 5 pieces of evidence. 5 chances to change the course of the investigation, and all were ignored. When you put it all together, you're left not with an empty space. You're left with a feeling that the truth was deliberately slowed down, as if every step toward it was pruned, filtered, postponed. It's like assembling a 500-piece puzzle with only 200 pieces on the table. And worse, with the most important pieces locked away in a drawer that no one wants to open. Over time, the case stopped being about where is Madeleine and became a battle of narratives. And in that battle, the most convenient version won. The one that comforts, the one that preserves reputations, the one that keeps any suspicion away from the inner circle. We're not saying we know exactly what happened, but it's impossible to ignore what was discarded. Nietzsche wrote that there are no facts, only interpretations. And maybe that's what is most frightening about this case. Because if the truth is treated as a matter of convenience, anyone can be innocent or guilty, depending on who's telling the story. But perhaps the true shock is this: the truth wasn't buried, it was dismantled, piece by piece, diluted until it seemed like it was never there. And even so, it remains alive. Because the more time passes, the more people begin to notice the gaps, the long pauses in interviews, the rehearsed silences, the versions that change over time, the fixed expression of those who know there are questions that should not be asked. This video is not a verdict, it's a mirror. And perhaps the most uncomfortable reflection isn't that of justice that failed, but of us accepting things without question. And if you think you've seen it all, there's still one more piece to this puzzle, a piece that many tried to hide, but that now is about to appear. By now you've probably realized, perhaps the greatest crime in this case wasn't just the disappearance of a child. Perhaps the true disappearance was that of the truth. It's strange to think about, isn't it? Because from the start, everything seemed to be there. The commotion, the headlines, the official statements, the images of the search. It seemed like there was movement, but movement is not the same as direction. And when noise replaces genuine silence, you lose what really matters. We live in a time when we're used to receiving ready-made versions of reality, a story with a beginning, middle, and end, an easily digestible explanation for everything that bothers us. But in this case, the deeper we dig, the more we realize nothing adds up. The 5 pieces of evidence presented here today are not just forgotten details. They are like cracks in an apparently intact glass, each one small on its own, but together they shatter the entire structure of the official narrative. And a crack, no matter how small, is a sign that something much deeper is trying to break free. And that's where everything changes. Because the feeling that remains is not just one of doubt, it's one of neglect, of convenience, of power. It wasn't a lack of time, it wasn't a lack of technology, it wasn't a lack of resources, it was a lack of will. A real will to face what is unsettling, what hurts, what exposes. This isn't theory, it's repeated experience. How many other cases have you seen where the truth was replaced by a convenient version? How many times did those involved have strong family names, influential friends, access to the right media? The Madeleine case became a symbol, not only of a family's pain, but of the limits of the trust we place in institutions. Because when evidence disappears, witnesses vanish, and versions change. Something is being protected. And when what is protected is more important than what was lost, then justice loses its name. There's no way to go through all of this and not feel a deep unease. I confess, while writing this script, reviewing every source, every testimony, every archival image, There were moments when I had to stop, to breathe, because it's revolting to see how truth can be manipulated with such calm, with so much control. And the most frightening part, this didn't happen in the shadows. It happened in front of everyone. It was televised, it was narrated in real time, and yet the most inconvenient to be part of the main script. It's as if someone had been editing the story in real time, cutting out the parts that didn't fit the ideal version, and what was left was this, a never-ending case with familiar faces, repeated phrases, and deafening silences. The feeling that remains is that truth was dismantled, not destroyed, because it is still there, in fragments, in the accounts of those who were ignored, in the pages that never made it to the press, in the eyes of those who tried to alert but were silenced with labels, sensationalist, conspiracist, overreacting. But when you put those fragments together carefully, with courage, you can see, you can feel, you can understand what perhaps was never meant to be understood. And then the question changes. It stops being, who did this? And becomes, who had an interest in keeping it that way? Because this goes beyond a poorly resolved crime. It touches on a wound we carry in silence. The feeling that, deep down, justice only works up to a certain point. And that when it threatens to cross the line of what's acceptable, when it gets too close to those with too much power, someone slams on the brakes. And if you've come this far with me, it's because this touches you too. It's because deep down, you feel that this story still has missing parts. And more than that there is something important hidden among the versions. Something that might never be said officially, but that needs to be felt, understood, shared. It's not just about Madeleine. It's about all the cases where silence triumphed over evidence, where truth was isolated, like a forgotten piece at the bottom of a drawer. And that's why this video doesn't end with a period, because there's still one missing piece, and it isn't here, it's somewhere else. A place where this discussion continues, where other hidden details begin to emerge, where the story takes on new contours. I've left content in the first pinned comment. It's for those who, like you, are not satisfied with what was said. It's for those who still feel there's something behind, something important. I won't say what it is, but if you've read this far, you'll understand when it arrives. Oh, and if you want to follow everything that's coming, you know what to do. Subscribe to the channel. Here, we don't accept the first version of the story, and if you stayed with me until the end, comment below. I'm the kind of person who wants the whole truth. That's how I'll know who is really with me in this search. Because as long as there are people who want to know, the truth won't rest, and neither will I.